In December 1986, the Department of Trade and Industry began an investigation into one of the most celebrated corporate takeovers in British history, and what it found underneath was a machine. The machine had been built to do one thing: hold the share price of Guinness plc above a number that would make the takeover succeed, by buying Guinness shares with Guinness's own money through a network of companies and investors who had been promised, in secret, that they would never lose a penny. The takeover was worth £2.5 billion. The target was the Distillers Company, which owned Johnnie Walker, Dewars, Gordon's Gin, and half the whiskey brands the world recognized. The man who ran the machine was Ernest Saunders, the chief executive of Guinness, and for a few months in 1986, he was the most admired businessman in the City of London. Within 2 years, he would be charged with theft, conspiracy, and false accounting, and the trial that followed would be the largest fraud case the English courts had seen. Saunders was not an obvious candidate for the role. He was Austrian by birth, educated in Switzerland, and had spent most of his career at Nestlé, where he was a marketing man, not a deal maker. He had come to Guinness in 1981 when the company was in trouble. The beer business was flat, the management was complacent, and the share price was drifting. What Saunders did at Guinness over the next 5 years was, by every visible measure, extraordinary. He cut costs, sold off peripheral businesses, sharpened the brand, and tripled the share price. He was knighted for services to business. By 1985, he had the credibility to do something the old Guinness board would never have attempted: bid for a company 5 times Guinness's size. To understand what he did next, you need to understand how a share-based takeover works, because the crime hides inside the mechanism. When a company bids for another company using its own shares as payment, the price of those shares is the currency. If Guinness offers to buy Distillers by giving Distillers shareholders a certain number of Guinness shares for every Distillers share they hold, then the value of the deal rises and falls with the Guinness share price. If the share price goes up, the offer is worth more and shareholders accept. If it falls, the offer is worth less and shareholders walk away. The share price, in other words, is not a side effect of the takeover. It is the takeover, and the temptation it creates is obvious. If you can hold your own share price up during the offer period, you win. If you cannot, you lose. And there is no legal way for a company to buy its own shares in volume during a live takeover without telling the market it is doing so, because that would be the purest form of market manipulation, propping up the very number that determines whether the deal goes through. What Saunders did was find a way to buy Guinness shares without it looking like Guinness was buying them. He recruited a small group of wealthy individuals and investment vehicles, mostly connected to him through personal relationships or through the merchant bank advising Guinness on the bid, which was Morgan Grenfell. The bank's star corporate financier, Roger Seelig, helped build the network. Between them, Saunders and Seelig assembled a ring of buyers and arranged for them to purchase Guinness shares during the critical weeks of the Distillers' bid. They were not buying with their own money, or not entirely. Guinness was providing the funds, either directly or through intermediary accounts, and Guinness was also providing an indemnity, a secret promise that if the share price fell and the buyers lost money, Guinness would make them whole. The effect was to create the appearance of independent market demand for Guinness shares at the precise moment when that demand determined the outcome of the biggest corporate deal in British history. The total amount spent on share support came to approximately £200 million, Some of it went through Swiss accounts. Some went through nominee companies in the Channel Islands. Some went through the personal accounts of men who thought they were doing a favor for a friend and collecting a fee for a service that was not, as far as they understood it, illegal. The share price held. The offer succeeded. Guinness absorbed Distillers and became one of the largest drinks companies in the world. Saunders was hailed as a visionary. The financial press called it the deal of the decade. He appeared on the cover of business magazines. The Queen's New Year Honours List, which had already knighted him once, was expected to elevate him further. The problem was that none of it was authorised. The indemnities were never disclosed to the Guinness Board, the Guinness shareholders, the London Stock Exchange, or the Takeover panel. The money used to fund the purchases was taken from Guinness without authorization. The entire support operation was hidden inside a web of invoices described as consultancy fees, success fees, and advisory payments that had no corresponding work behind them. When the DTI investigators began pulling the threads, what came out was a list. Gerald Ronson, the property developer, had bought Guinness shares on a promise that he would be repaid £5 million regardless of what happened to the price. He was repaid. Jack Lyons, a financier, received a similar arrangement. Anthony Parnes, a stockbroker, had acted as a go-between, arranging purchases and collecting commissions. Each of them had been drawn in by the same offer. Buy the shares, hold them through the bid period, and Guinness will make sure you do not lose. The total value of the disguised payments, when the investigators added them up, came to just over £25 million, a fraction of the takeover's value, but enough to have tipped the balance at the moment it mattered. The trial opened in February 1990 and lasted 107 days. The four men in the dock, Saunders, Ronson, Lyons, and Parnes, became known as the Guinness Four, and between them, they represented the first serious prosecution of city insiders since the Financial Services Act had been passed in 1986. The city had spent years arguing that it could regulate itself. This was the test of whether the new regime had any teeth. The prosecution's case was built on paper. Internal Guinness memos showed Saunders directing the share support operation in detail. Bank records showed the money moving from Guinness accounts to the buyers and back again as disguised fees. The indemnity letters, which should never have existed, and they proved that the buyers were not independent investors expressing a market view, but paid agents executing a plan. Saunders was convicted of theft and false accounting and sentenced to 5 years. Ronson received 1 year in prison and a fine of £5 million. Parnes received 2.5 years. Lyons, who was 75 and in poor health, was stripped of his knighthood, the first such forfeiture in decades, and fined £4 million. The sentences were later reduced on appeal, but the convictions stood and the reputations did not recover. What happened next to Ernest Saunders is the part of this story that nobody has ever satisfactorily explained. In 1991, Saunders was released from prison after serving 10 months of his 5-year sentence on the grounds that he was suffering from Alzheimer's disease. His lawyers presented medical evidence that his cognitive decline was severe and irreversible, and the Home Secretary granted early release on compassionate grounds. Saunders walked out of Ford Open Prison looking frail and confused, and the newspapers reported it as a tragedy. A man destroyed by the system, his mind gone. Within a year, he was back in business. He took on consultancy work for firms in the food and drinks industry. He attended dinners in Mayfair. He sat on advisory boards. He gave interviews in which he was sharp, articulate, and fully in command of his faculties. He remembered names, dates, and the detail of transactions that had happened a decade earlier. The Alzheimer's diagnosis, which had secured his freedom, appeared to have reversed itself entirely. No medical authority has ever confirmed that Alzheimer's disease can reverse. It is a progressive, degenerative, terminal condition. Once the brain tissue is lost, it does not grow back. Saunders never publicly addressed the discrepancy. He simply moved on, and the system that had released him moved on as well. Nobody was prosecuted for presenting misleading medical evidence. Nobody in the Home Office was held to account for accepting it. The early release stood. Saunders lived another 3 decades and died in September 2022 at the age of 87, reportedly in full possession of his mental faculties. The case became, in city shorthand, the Saunders affair, and it is still cited in every textbook on corporate governance and securities fraud in English law. But the lesson it taught was not the one the authorities intended. The Guinness fraud changed how the City of London was policed, but the change was not the one the prosecutors had hoped for. The trial proved that the new regulatory system could convict, but the sentences and Saunders' early release sent a second message that was louder than the first. The cost of the largest share support fraud in British history was 10 months in an open prison for the man who ran it, and nothing at all for the mechanism that let him walk out. Every share-based takeover since the Guinness affair has been subject to stricter disclosure rules, tighter monitoring of share movements during bid periods, and a regulatory apparatus that did not exist before 1986. Those rules exist because of what happened in the Distillers' bid. Whether they would have caught Saunders is a question that depends on how much faith you place in the same system that released him after 10 months. The shares Saunders manipulated were worth £2.5 billion. The company he built with them still exists, now part of DIAGEO. The brands he acquired, Johnnie Walker, Gordon's, Tanqueray, generate billions in revenue every year. The fraud that secured them was never unwound. The Distillers' shareholders who accepted the inflated offer were never compensated for the difference between what they were promised and what the shares were genuinely worth. The takeover stood, the conviction stood, and the early release stood. And between those 3 facts, the city learned exactly what the new rules cost. 10 months in a prison where you can walk across the grounds, and a diagnosis that disappeared the moment the gates closed behind you. That was the price of the biggest share fraud in British history.